A mafia boss who had been told he could never father a child, knelt in the mud before two abandoned kids, and felt his entire world crack open in that single breath. Stefan Valente stood there in his three-piece suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. The fabric still pristine despite the filth soaking through to his knees, and his eyes locked onto the girl, clutching a newborn against her bony chest, as if that baby were the only thing keeping her alive. She could not have been more than 6 years old. But those eyes carried a weight he recognized instantly. The same hollow emptiness he felt every night when he walked back into his penthouse and found nothing but silence and shadows waiting for him. The same void that had swallowed his marriage to Brin, turning two people who shared a last name into strangers who ate at opposite ends of a 12-seat table without exchanging a single word. The only difference was this girl had someone to protect. For 15 years, Stefan had built an empire from blood and concrete, controlled half of Chicago's underground, accumulated more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, bought judges, buried enemies, bent the city to his will. But he had never been able to buy the one thing he actually wanted. And the doctors had made sure he knew he never would, that his bloodline, the Valente name his grandfather had killed to preserve, would die with him. And now, kneeling in the mud outside an abandoned warehouse on the south side, a warehouse that sat on his territory in his world, he had found two children who needed exactly what he had to give, but had never been allowed to. He said his name slowly, extending his hand the way you would approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. And the girl pressed herself harder against the rotting wall, calculating the danger with a precision that made his chest tighten because it was the same calculation he made in rooms full of men who wanted him dead. Except she was gambling with her own life. Phoebe. Her voice so small he almost missed it. "My name is Phoebe." Then she told him the baby in her arms was her brother Theo. That their mama had left 3 days ago. Promised she would come back, but never did. And the girl said it all without a flicker of emotion in her voice, as if she were recounting the weather or what she had had for breakfast. And it was that flatness, that terrible rehearsed calm of a child who had already learned that crying changed nothing, that split Stefan Valente clean in half. For the first time in 15 years, the most dangerous man in Chicago completely forgot how to breathe. He swallowed the sharp ache in his throat and reached into his ruined jacket for his phone. Stefan called Orion in a voice the hardened enforcer had never heard before. Not a commanding tone or a threatening bark, but the voice of a man trying to stay calm and not knowing how. He told him to bring the armored SUV immediately, and Orion did not ask any questions. The heavy vehicle stopped in front of the warehouse in under 10 minutes, with headlights sweeping through the dark like twin blades. Orion stepped out into the freezing rain and froze when he saw what was standing in front of him. His boss, the man half of Chicago trembled to even talk about, was kneeling in a field of mud with a ragged little girl clutching a newborn. The suit worth tens of thousands of dollars was caked with dirt from the knees down. His eyes held something Orion had never seen in 8 years of loyal service, because it looked exactly like terror. Orion opened the back door without saying a single word, and Stefan reached out a hand to Phoebe. But the little girl did not take his hand and only looked into the car at the pristine cream leather seats. She looked at the soft interior light and at a world completely unlike anything she had ever known in her short life. Then she looked down at her own feet that were bare, muddy, scraped, and bleeding. She asked in a voice so small the wind almost swallowed it if she would dirty his car. Those words hit Stefan in the chest harder than any bullet he had ever dodged in his violent career. This 6-year-old child was not afraid of being hit or being abandoned one more time. She was only afraid that the single thing keeping her from going back to the freezing mud was whether she was clean enough to sit on luxury leather. Stefan knelt again right beside the open door and met her eyes with a gentle steadiness. He told her to get in because it was just a car and it did not matter. Phoebe climbed in with tiny steps so careful it was like the floor might give out beneath her. She perched on the very edge of the seat with only a quarter of her body and her back stiff as a board. Both of her arms locked around Theo as she stared straight ahead and stayed too scared to touch anything inside the vehicle. Orion drove while glancing up at the rearview mirror every few seconds. What he saw there made him grip the leather wheel tighter than he ever had during a brutal shootout. Stefan Valente was sitting beside a 6-year-old with the face of a man who simply did not know what to do. Theo started to cry with a weak and thin moan that cut through the silent SUV like a dull blade. It was the cry of a baby so exhausted he did not have enough breath left to be loud. Phoebe immediately began rocking her brother, and her lips moved in whisper Stefan could not make out. She recognized the soothing rhythm and spoke words a 6-year-old should never know how to say because she should not have to be a mother. She said without looking at Stefan that he was hungry and she had not found anything to feed him since yesterday. Her voice stayed flat the way it had been when she talked about her mother leaving them to die. Stefan leaned forward and ordered Orion to stop at the nearest 24-hour pharmacy immediately. The glowing signs of a corner drugstore washed harsh white fluorescent light over Stefan as he walked inside like a ghost from another world. His suit was ruined and his hair was slipping out of its perfect slick style. He stood in the baby aisle with the wide eyes of a man who had been thrown into foreign territory that did not speak his language. He stared at rows of formula without knowing which one was safe for a starving newborn. He did not know a diaper size fit or which bottle would not make a fragile baby choke. For 15 years, he had run an empire without hesitation and made split-second decisions involving human lives. But in front of a colorful diaper shelf, he felt like he was reading a language he had never learned. A young clerk with a ponytail came closer and stared at the mud on his expensive clothes. Stefan told her in a raspy voice that he needed everything for a newborn and food for a 6-year-old girl. The clerk pulled items from the shelves without asking questions, and Stefan paid without looking at the total. He stuffed everything into 2 large bags and walked back out to the waiting SUV where Phoebe was still glued to the window. Stefan opened the formula container with fingers that 3 hours earlier had signed an order to launder $4 million. He read the mixing instructions under the dim dome light and measured each scoop with intense focus. When he poured warm water into the plastic bottle, his hands actually shook from a terrifying vulnerability. He was holding something more fragile than anything he had ever touched, and he was terrified of breaking it. He handed the bottle to Phoebe, and she took it with both hands like it was absolute treasure. She guided the nipple to Theo, and the baby drank with a silent desperation while his tiny fingers pawed at the empty air. Phoebe watched her brother with eyes that held deep relief and a pain far deeper than any child should carry. Stefan offered a cheap prepackaged sandwich to the little girl, and she unwrapped it with painstaking care. She made sure not a single crumb fell, and then she took her first bite and chewed terribly slowly. Stefan had to turn his face away because he could not watch her eat like someone who knew every bite might be her last. He thought of the elaborate dinner he had not bothered to touch tonight at his 12-seat table. The private elevator glided smoothly upward and opened onto the penthouse floor a little before 2 in the morning. The first thing Stefan saw was that the living room lights were still blazing bright. That meant his estranged wife Brin was not asleep and was sitting with a book in the corner of the heavy sofa. That was exactly how she locked herself inside her own world, so she would not have to admit she lived in the home of a man she despised. Stefan stepped out onto the cold marble with Phoebe following close behind him like a frightened shadow. The little girl still held Theo tight, and her bare toes curled back as if the cold stone might swallow her whole. Behind them, Orion carried the 2 pharmacy bags with the blank face of a soldier trying to understand a new war. Brin heard the heavy footsteps and looked up from her book as the silence stretched out to swallow them all. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds, but it felt to Stefan like 3 grueling years. She saw the filthy mud on his suit, and then her eyes moved down to the ragged children. Brin saw the torn clothes and the bruised bare feet and the newborn wrapped in a scrap of dirty fabric. The book slipped from her hands and hit the floor, but she did not even try to pick it up. She stood up and her gaze moved sharply from the children to Stefan and back again. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, and that was how Stefan knew she was truly furious. Brin never shouted when she was angry for real because she simply went freezing cold and surgical. Each word came out clean and sharp like a scalpel she used to wield in the emergency room. She told him he had brought abandoned kids into a crime den instead of calling the police or child services. Stefan set the bags on the floor with slow control and met her furious eyes without blinking. He told her that calling the authorities meant they would separate the 6-year-old from the newborn and throw them into the system. The words hit exactly where Stefan meant them to hit, and he hated himself for using her past as a weapon. But he needed her to stop looking at him like a monster and start looking at the children who desperately needed her to survive. Brin stood frozen as the silence between them stretched and said more than any confession ever could. Stefan had just told her that calling the authorities meant the system would separate the 6-year-old from the newborn. Those words hit her exactly where he meant them to hit because she had been separated from her own brother in the foster system a lifetime ago. She finally looked at Phoebe without the lens of sharp anger aimed at her estranged husband. She saw a child who had learned that anyone could disappear at any moment and who never trusted anyone in the world. Brin walked over to the little girl and kneeled down slow and deliberate. It was not the kind of desperate kneeling in mud that Stefan had done outside the warehouse. It was the calm and measured kneel of a pediatric nurse, making herself small and unthreatening. Phoebe stepped back on instinct, but her back hit the wall and there was nowhere left to go. She stayed perfectly still and held her baby brother tight while staring at the strange woman with old eyes measuring every millimeter of space. Brin did not touch her or reach out or make a single gesture that could be mistaken for trying to take the baby away. She only spoke in the gentlest voice she possessed and used a tone Stefan had never heard her use inside this penthouse. "What is your brother's name?" Brin asked in a gentle whisper. She did not ask if the girl was okay or tell her not to be scared. Brin understood that for this ruined child the baby was everything and the only reason she was still standing. Asking about the brother was how Brin told Phoebe that she saw what mattered most and was not there to take it away. Phoebe watched Brin for a long time while Stefan stood behind them and held his breath without realizing it. Then something in those old eyes finally shifted just a fraction of an inch right at the threshold of trust. Phoebe loosened her iron hold on Theo just enough to let her chest pull in a deeper breath. She finally allowed herself to believe that maybe she did not have to squeeze until she could not breathe to keep him safe anymore. Brin stood up and her voice lost all its anger and shifted into a clinical and clipped tone. "I need warm water and clean towels in the guest bathroom immediately because the baby needs a bath right now," Brin told Stefan. Stefan nodded and led her to a massive bathroom made of white marble and gold fixtures that no one had used since the penthouse was built. Brin kneeled again on the cold stone and looked directly into the little girl's watchful eyes. "Can I hold your brother for just a minute to bathe him?" Brin asked softly. "You can stand right here and watch every single second." Phoebe looked at the luxurious bathroom and down at Theo before giving a tiny nod you could barely see. She transferred her brother into Brin's arms with a care so precise it was like the infant was made of spun glass. Brin carried Theo into the warm light and unwrapped the filthy cloth around his tiny body. Her hand stopped moving and her face changed completely as Stefan stood behind them and looked over her shoulder. The baby's body was too small in a way that was terrifying and deeply unnatural. His ribs were outlined beneath skin that was as thin as wet paper, and his belly was swollen from severe malnutrition instead of fullness. His arms and legs looked like fragile sticks and his skin was gray and bloodless. Brin lowered him into the warm water so gently the surface barely rippled, and the baby did not even cry when he touched the water. He only startled weakly and went completely still because he was too exhausted to react to the new sensation. That terrible quiet made Brin bite down hard on her lip to keep her hands from shaking, because a healthy newborn would scream when lowered into unfamiliar water. She bathed him with delicate motions she had learned in the pediatric ward of a public hospital where abandoned children were brought in at midnight. She used a soft cloth to clean each finger and each fold of skin while memorizing every old bruise she found. When she was finally done, she wrapped Theo in a thick white bath towel 3 times bigger than his body and held him secure in one arm. She motioned Phoebe closer with her free hand and kept her voice perfectly level. "It is your turn now, and I need to see your foot," Brin told her. Phoebe shook her head and stepped back, but Brin had already seen the way she shifted her weight to avoid stepping on her left heel. Under the bright bathroom light, Brin could clearly see the sole of the girl's foot was swollen and raw with a cut that had turned dangerously infected. The skin around it was hot to the touch, and the angry redness was already climbing toward her small ankle. Brin turned and placed Theo directly into Stefan's hands without asking or pleading for his help. She simply put the baby there as if it was the most obvious thing in the world for a crime boss to hold an infant. Stefan took the baby with 2 stiff hands and held him a few inches from his chest because he did not know whether to pull him close. The tiny boy lay in the massive hands of Chicago's most feared mafia boss like he was resting on a warm rock. Brin kneeled in front of Phoebe and lifted her left foot gently. Phoebe hisses in sharp pain, but did not cry because this child had forgotten how to cry a very long time ago. "This foot needs heavy antibiotics, and the baby needs a pediatrician right this second," Brin said to Stefan without looking up. Stefan held Theo securely with one arm and used his free hand to pull out his phone and dial a number he only used for emergencies. He called Dr. Faith, who was the only doctor outside the underworld he trusted enough to wake at 2 in the morning. She was a woman who stitched bullet wounds on his men without asking questions while he fully funded her free clinic on the west side. Dr. Faith arrived at the penthouse within 40 minutes with her hair twisted up fast and her eyes heavy with sleep. When she saw Theo, her face shifted from ordinary fatigue to a mask of professional composure, hiding deep worry. She examined Theo first and weighed him and listened to his fragile heart before looking up at Stefan with steady eyes. "He needs a high-calorie formula every 2 hours, even overnight, or he will have to be admitted to a hospital," Dr. Faith explained. Then she examined Phoebe's foot and shook her head slightly before saying the infection was spreading, but had not reached her bloodstream yet. She wrote strong prescriptions and handed them to Brin while looking at Stefan with an expression resembling pure curiosity. She looked like she was wondering if this highly dangerous man actually understood what he had just stepped into. After the doctor left, Brin mixed the special formula and fed Theo until he finally fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. Phoebe refused to sleep in the massive guest bed and instead curled into a tight ball on the living room sofa in a defensive posture. Brin draped a soft blanket over the little girl and turned to see Stefan standing in the middle of the room looking absolutely helpless. They stood 2 meters apart, but for the first time in their arranged marriage they looked at each other, without an invisible wall between them. "I will stay and feed the baby every 2 hours and change the bandages," Brin whispered in the quiet room. "But I am doing all of this for the children and absolutely not for you." Stefan looked at her and simply nodded his head. That fragile silent truce was exactly enough to get them through the night. The days after that first night repeated in a strange new rhythm that no one in the sprawling penthouse had ever known before. Brin fed Theo exactly on schedule and changed Phoebe's bandages and took temperatures while writing down medication times in a small notebook. Stefan fumbled his way into the massive gaps with the few things he could actually do without causing harm. He held Theo with stiff arms when Brin needed both hands free, and he drove out in the armored SUV to buy more formula when they ran dangerously low. He sat completely still beside Phoebe while she ate her breakfast at the massive dining table. And Phoebe ate absolutely everything that was put in front of her with a desperate and terrifying speed. But at every single meal, Brin noticed a slice of bread disappeared from the ceramic plate. It always reappeared later in the coat pocket of the oversized jacket Brin had loaned her. The bread was folded neat and tucked deep where the traumatized little girl thought no one would ever find it. Brin did not speak about the stolen food, and she did not take it out of the hidden pocket. She did not explain to the terrified child that she did not have to hoard scraps because she would never go hungry in this penthouse. Brin knew those hollow words would never work because 20 years ago she had done the exact same thing. She had hidden stale bread in her own pockets in every new foster house the system had thrown her into. She did it not only because she was starving, but because food was the only thing she could control in a world where everything else could be ripped away. So instead of confronting the trauma with empty promises, Brin quietly placed an extra slice of bread beside Phoebe's breakfast plate every single morning. She made it look like a simple accident and made sure there was always more so the girl could hide it without an ounce of shame. On the fourth day, Phoebe still hid the bread, but she ate a little more of her actual meal. By the end of the first week, the extra slice stayed perfectly still on the plate, and Brin knew it was the first fragile sign the girl was starting to believe the next meal would actually come. On the fifth day, Phoebe ran a sudden fever that made her small body shiver violently on the living room sofa. It was not dangerously high, but it was enough to terrify Brin because the strong antibiotics and the freezing rain had worn the girl's immune system incredibly thin. Brin called Dr. Faith for urgent guidance, and the doctor told her to watch the child closely through the night and bring her to the clinic if the temperature climbed. Stefan was already halfway across Chicago to a mandatory meeting with 3 ruthless captains who controlled the northern smuggling lines. It was a brutal sit-down he had already postponed twice and could not postpone again without losing immense face in the criminal underworld. But when Orion texted him from the penthouse that the little girl was burning up with a fever, Stefan immediately told his enforcer to turn the heavy car around. Orion glanced into the rearview mirror and reminded his boss about the waiting captains, but Stefan did not repeat his command. Orion spun the armored wheel and drove the mafia boss straight back to a sick child instead of a criminal empire. That night, Stefan sat in a heavy leather chair pulled right beside the sofa, where Phoebe lay trapped in a feverish and restless sleep. He watched her shallow breathing for hours and sometimes placed his large hand gently on her burning forehead to check her temperature. He checked it in a careful way he did not even know he had learned. It was perhaps pulled from a faint childhood memory of his own grandfather's hand on his forehead the last time before the old man died. Brin woke at 3 in the morning to feed the crying newborn and passed quietly through the shadowed living room. She stopped dead when she saw Stefan still sitting there in the dark with his head slightly tilted and his eyes locked on the sick little girl. His massive hand was resting softly on the edge of the blanket right near Phoebe's tiny fingers, but he was careful not to wake her. Brin paused in the cold hallway shadows and watched him for 10 silent seconds before she turned away to tend to the baby. And in those 10 quiet seconds, for the first time since the day she had signed their bitter marriage papers, she wondered if the ice inside Chicago's most dangerous man was finally starting to melt. Grant Whitmore came to the sprawling penthouse on the afternoon of the 10th day. He arrived on time, as always, in his impeccable gray suit and carrying a worn brown leather briefcase. He wore the expressionless face of a highly paid lawyer who had kept the Valente family secrets buried for over 30 years. But when he stepped through the heavy double doors, he saw something that made him freeze. He saw a pair of tiny pink children's shoes lined up right beside Stefan's polished Oxfords in the marble entryway. He saw a wooden crib set up next to the living room sofa and a plastic baby bottle resting on the expensive coffee table where there was usually only a crystal glass of whiskey. Grant paused for exactly 1 beat before pulling out a leather chair in the home office and opening his briefcase without making a single comment. Stefan sat across the desk from him while Grant began speaking in a stiff lawyer's voice instead of the voice of someone who had known the boss for 3 decades. He explained that under strict Illinois law, Stefan was keeping 2 minors without a shred of legal standing. If child services found out or if anyone reported the sudden arrival, they would come take the children immediately and Stefan would face serious criminal kidnapping charges. The only viable legal route was to quickly file a petition for temporary guardianship through the Ruthless family court system. But Grant explained that process came with a mandatory home study, meaning a social worker would come to meticulously inspect the residence and aggressively interview both spouses. They would run deep background checks and rigorously assess the living conditions, and this was exactly where everything became incredibly complicated and highly dangerous. Grant opened a thick manila file and set it squarely on the desk before looking his boss straight in the eye. He reminded Stefan that the FBI had officially opened a massive surveillance file on him 7 years ago. A highly ambitious federal prosecutor named Preston Hale had made taking down the sprawling Valente empire his absolute personal mission. Hale had spent 5 agonizing years collecting circumstantial evidence, but never enough to actually secure a solid indictment against the elusive mafia boss. And if Stefan filed for legal guardianship, his infamous name would automatically enter the state system and Preston Hale would know immediately. Grant warned that the corrupt prosecutor would use this fragile family as brutal leverage not to save the children, but to force open a wider federal investigation into the organization and everything Stefan had built. Stefan listened to the grim warning without blinking, and his face remained perfectly still, but his strong jaw tightened dangerously. Grant knew exactly what that silent tension meant, but he pressed forward anyway, with a desperate sliver of hope. He told Stefan that he actually possessed one major advantage that most dangerous men in his position simply did not have. He had a legally binding wife, and on paper, he was the legitimate CEO of a massive investment firm. He had stable and luxurious housing and a seemingly respectable marriage that had lasted for 18 quiet months. A guardianship petition coming from a stable married couple with massive legitimate finances was far stronger than one coming from a terrifying single man. And if both spouses willingly signed the legal documents and both appeared united in family court, their odds of keeping the children would rise significantly. Grant finished his blunt assessment and watched Stefan while a heavy silence fell over the shadowed office. In that stretching silence, they both knew the real problem was not the letter of the law or the ambitious Preston Hale. The real terrifying problem was whether the cold woman down the hall would actually agree to help him. They both knew the woman who had signed their bitter marriage papers to erase a debt and absolutely not for love would despise being dragged into family court. Brin had sacrificed her own freedom 18 months ago solely to wipe out the staggering $4.5 million gambling debt her reckless late brother had owed to the Valente syndicate. She had treated the forced marriage like a miserable prison sentence, and she hated the criminal empire Stefan controlled. Brin stood quietly at the doorway of the kids' room where she had just laid Theo into the crib after his afternoon feeding. She had heard the entire conversation between the lawyer and the boss, not because she was trying to eavesdrop, but because the penthouse was so open and Grant's booming voice carried. A single sharp and painful thought crystallized in her tired mind. The fake marriage she had signed because she had absolutely no other choice was now the only thing that could keep 2 innocent children from being thrown into the very same broken system that had crushed her own life. Stefan appeared at the end of the long hallway and looked at her with tired eyes. He did not need to ask whether she had heard the lawyer, because the heavy answer was already written plainly on her pale face. He asked her only one simple question, and his deep voice was low and surprisingly gentle. It was not a harsh mafia order, but a voice Brin had never heard him use with her before, because it sounded almost like a desperate plea. He simply asked if she was willing to do it. Brin looked at his shadowed face and then looked past his broad shoulder into the room where Phoebe sat guarding her brother's sleep with unblinking eyes. Then she looked back at Stefan, and her voice was steady and perfectly clear. She told him that she would do it for the children, but absolutely not for him. She did not need to say anything else, because they both completely understood the strict boundary of their new arrangement. But when Brin turned back toward the crib and Stefan returned to the office, they both knew this second agreement was entirely different from the first one. The first contract had been a cold financial exchange between bitter enemies, but this one had 2 sleeping children sitting right in the middle of it. When children are involved, nothing is ever completely an act. Stefan sat back down heavily across from Grant, and the veteran lawyer looked at his dangerous boss with deep concern. 30 years of loyally serving the violent Valente family had taught him never to show weakness, but he could not hide his fear now. Grant warned Stefan that this reckless legal move could easily destroy the entire organization and the massive empire he had spent his life building. If Preston Hale successfully used a high-profile guardianship case to drag Stefan's dark secrets into the blinding public light, he could lose his freedom forever. Stefan met the lawyer's gaze with the terrifying eyes everyone in Chicago's brutal underworld knew never to challenge. They were the cold eyes that had made hardened captains bow and made traitors tremble and made corrupt judges look away in fear. He leaned forward and said 2 simple words in a voice no louder than a rough whisper, but heavier than any execution order he had ever given. He told his lawyer to find a way. Orion Banks had spent 8 years burying bodies and hunting ghosts for the Valente family. Finding a missing woman in the sprawling Chicago underworld was exactly the kind of quiet and violent work he excelled at. Stefan had given him the strict order right after Grant left the penthouse. The boss wanted the biological mother of the 2 children found before the ruthless federal prosecutor could locate her and use her as a legal weapon. Orion started his hunt on the freezing South Side streets exactly where the children had been abandoned. He squeezed information out of desperate junkies and terrified street hustlers with the heavy thread of his massive fists. It only took him 48 hours to trace the fragile ghost of a woman named Jolene. But the dark trail led him straight into a nightmare that even a hardened enforcer like Orion found difficult to stomach. The location was a heavily fortified concrete warehouse tucked blindly behind an abandoned meatpacking plant. Orion parked his unmarked vehicle 3 blocks away and observed the perimeter through military-grade binoculars in the freezing rain. He counted a dozen heavily armed men patrolling the chained fences with assault rifles hanging casually from their thick shoulders. They were running a vicious trafficking ring that preyed on the most desperate and forgotten women in the broken city. And inside that freezing concrete hell, Orion finally spotted Jolene through a cracked high window. She was a devastatingly thin woman with hollow eyes and yellow bruises blooming violently across her pale throat. She was trapped inside a locked cage with 5 other women who looked like they had already given up on surviving. Jolene was exactly the mother who had left her starving children in the mud because she had been dragged back to hell before she could ever return to them. Orion lowered his heavy binoculars and felt a cold sickness twist deep inside his gut. It was not the casual brutality of the trafficking ring that made the veteran enforcer sick. It was the brutal and undeniable truth of who actually owned the territory where this nightmare was allowed to operate. Orion recognized the specific gang tattoos bleeding on the thick necks of the armed guards outside the warehouse. He recognized the specific faces of the men who collected the dirty money and beat the terrified women. This vicious ring operated completely untouched on the South Side because they paid massive monthly protection fees directly to the Valente organization. The bloody money flowed upward through greedy lieutenants and washed clean before it ever reached the pristine penthouse. Stefan Valente had built his massive empire on blood and concrete, but he had never bothered to look closely at the rotting foundation holding it all up. Orion drove back to the towering penthouse with a silence heavier than lead pressing down on his broad shoulders. He walked into Stefan's shadowed office, where the boss was quietly reviewing legal documents for the fragile guardianship case. Orion stood rigid in front of the heavy desk and delivered the intelligence report in a perfectly flat voice. He described the heavily guarded warehouse and the 12 armed men and the terrified mother locked in a dirty cage. Then he dropped the final devastating piece of information like a live grenade onto the polished wood. He told his boss that the trafficking ring holding Jolene captive was paying them hundreds of thousands of dollars every single month for absolute protection. Stefan stopped reading, and the entire room went completely dead and silent. The terrifying mafia boss sat frozen in his expensive leather chair as the horrifying truth finally shattered his perfect armor. Stefan Valente had saved the 2 starving children from the freezing mud, but his own criminal empire was the exact reason they had been dying in the first place. Stefan sat in the crushing silence of his office long after Orion finished speaking. The heavy mahogany desk suddenly felt like a tombstone beneath his hands. He looked down at his own fingers and remembered how they had shaken while mixing warm baby formula just a few weeks ago. Now he realized those exact same hands had signed the ledgers protecting the monsters who starved that baby. The Valente Empire had fed the absolute worst demons in Chicago because Stefan had been too arrogant to look at the minor details of his massive wealth. He felt a sickening rot spread through his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. It was the crushing and suffocating weight of pure guilt. He looked up at Orion standing perfectly still in the shadows. Stefan did not yell or break glass or show a single ounce of blind rage. He gave a quiet order in a voice that sounded like grinding stones and told his enforcer to erase every single man in that warehouse in exactly 48 hours. Orion did not ask questions and simply nodded before disappearing into the dark city. The eradication of the South Side trafficking ring was not a gang war, but a total and silent extermination. Within 2 days, the 12 heavily armed guards simply stopped existing on the streets of Chicago. The concrete warehouse was breached in the dead of night by men who moved like absolute shadows. Heavy iron doors were kicked off their hinges and the dirty cages were shattered open. Jolene and the 5 terrified women were pulled from the freezing darkness and placed into waiting unmarked vans. They were driven straight to clean safe houses and handed thick envelopes of cash to start over. The men who had kept them in chains were never seen or heard from again. Stefan Valente completely erased a highly profitable piece of his own criminal empire without a single second of hesitation. He burned his own territory to the absolute ground just to wipe the mud off a 6-year-old girl's memory. Brin learned the terrifying truth the very next morning when she carried Theo into the home office. She saw the grim news playing silently on the television screen about a massive gang disappearance on the South Side. She looked at Stefan sitting behind his desk, and she instantly understood exactly what he had done. Her face went completely white, and she held the sleeping baby tighter against her chest. She stepped fully into the room and confronted the dangerous man she had married to erase a massive debt. "You killed them," Brin whispered as her voice trembled terribly. "You murdered a dozen men to fix your own blind mistakes." Her terror was not born from a place of simple and ordinary fear. It was the profound horror of realizing her fake husband possessed the violent power of a dark god. He could snuff out human lives with a single whispered word from an expensive leather chair. Stefan stood up slowly and took the brutal accusation without offering a single word of defense. He did not try to justify the extreme violence or hide behind the excuse of protecting the broken women. He simply looked at Brin with eyes completely stripped of his usual arrogant armor. "I am the reason those children were dying in the rain," Stefan told her quietly. "My protection money locked their mother in a cage, and I had to burn it all down." Brin stared at him and felt a terrifying conflict tear her completely in half. She was deeply horrified by the ruthless monster standing right in front of her. But a small and secret part of her fractured soul completely understood his brutal and bloody justice. She realized that some terrible evils could only be erased by a much darker monster. Brin turned away and walked out of the office while leaving Stefan alone in the heavy silence he had created. The Department of Children and Family Services building on West Randolph was a cold and gray place that smelled of stale coffee and broken promises. Stefan and Brin sat on hard plastic chairs in a small waiting room under flickering fluorescent lights. Phoebe sat directly between them with her tiny hands gripping Brin's fingers so tightly her knuckles turned completely white. The little girl swept the sterile room with her old eyes, looking for an exit exactly the way she always did. Stefan watched the way the traumatized child clung to his estranged wife, and he felt a strange tightness deep in his chest. He knew that in the brutal war for this little girl's trust, Brin had gone much further than he ever could. A tired social worker finally opened the heavy wooden door and called them into a cramped office that felt entirely too small. They took their seats on one side of a scratched wooden table and waited in a suffocating silence for the door to open again. The door opened a second time and Jolene walked slowly into the sterile room. She was devastatingly thin, but completely clean of the filth from the warehouse cage where Orion had found her. She wore simple clothes provided by the secure safe house, and her dark hair was tied back tightly from her pale face. Her hollow eyes swept the room and locked instantly onto her 6-year-old daughter sitting across the table. Jolene collapsed into the empty chair and broke into violent sobs before she could speak a single word. She reached both of her trembling hands across the table toward the little girl she had left in the freezing mud. Phoebe looked at her biological mother with 10 different emotions crossing through her small face at the exact same time. The child desperately wanted to run into those familiar arms, but she also wanted to hide safely behind Brin's back. Phoebe finally stood up and walked around the table to let her crying mother hold her tightly. But she absolutely refused to let go of Brin's hand until the physical distance made it completely impossible. Jolene held her daughter and cried without making a single sound while her thin shoulders shook violently under her cheap shirt. Phoebe hugged her back, but the little girl did not shed a single tear because she had forgotten how to cry a long time ago. She just stood inside her mother's desperate embrace and looked over Jolene's shoulder directly at Brin to make sure the woman was still there. Then Phoebe spoke in a voice that was incredibly small, but painfully clear in the quiet office. "I am safe now," Phoebe whispered softly. "I eat real food every single day, and Miss Brin sings to Theo." Jolene pulled back and stared into her daughter's old eyes with a shattering realization. She saw that her child had finally found absolute safety, and that safety did not belong to her anymore. Jolene looked up across the table and her gaze landed heavily on Stefan sitting in perfect and intimidating silence. She instantly recognized the terrifying name of the man who rolled the dark streets where she had been enslaved and broken. "Why do you care about the kids of a broken street girl?" Jolene asked with a trembling voice. Stefan looked at her for a long time before he answered in a low voice stripped of all his dangerous power. "Because I was a kid nobody wanted either," Stefan answered in a quiet tone. Jolene stared at his dark eyes and saw absolute truth instead of another cruel manipulation. She started crying again for everything she had lost and everything she could never give her children. "I have no home and no job, and I cannot keep them safe," Jolene admitted through her heavy tears. "Please do not let them forget me." Brin stood up from her chair and walked around the table to kneel right beside the broken mother. Brin took the trembling hands of the woman she had never met but understood more deeply than anyone else in the room. "I promise you that I will care for them like my own, but you will always be their mother," Brin vowed with fierce certainty. Jolene looked at Brin and then at her daughter, watching them with cautious eyes before nodding her head slowly. She turned to the silent social worker and agreed to sign the temporary guardianship papers without a single moment of hesitation. The meeting ended with a desperate embrace between a mother and daughter before Jolene walked out the door. She walked away without looking back because she knew she would lose her fragile strength if she turned around. 8 months passed and the sterile penthouse transformed into an actual home. Phoebe stopped hiding extra bread in her oversized coat pockets and started leaving her toys on the expensive living room rug. Theo grew rapidly from a starving infant into a chubby baby who laughed loudly when Stefan held him. Brin stopped vanishing into her quiet bedroom after dinner and started lingering at the massive dining table. Stefan returned from the violent streets earlier every night just to sit beside his makeshift family. The bitter contract that had bound Brin to the dangerous mafia boss slowly began to dissolve into something completely different. They were no longer two cold strangers trapped in a terrible financial arrangement, but a man and a woman learning how to breathe. The cold marble floors finally held the warmth of a real family, and Stefan Valente believed he had finally secured the one thing his bloody money could never buy. But peace is the most fragile illusion in the Chicago underworld. Knox Wheeler was a 30-year-old lieutenant in charge of the southern smuggling lines, and he possessed a fatal abundance of greed. Stefan had trusted Knox enough to handle the most sensitive internal problems for the Valente syndicate. Knox was exactly the man who had personally processed the massive $4.5 million gambling debt Brin's late brother had accumulated. He knew the precise terms of the bitter marriage contract and the desperate reason Brin had signed her freedom away. Knox wanted a larger piece of the criminal empire, and he knew the fastest way to the top was to tear down the reigning king. He secretly arranged a midnight meeting in a damp underground parking garage in the Loop. He met with federal prosecutor Pristine Hale and handed over a silver flash drive containing every single devastating detail of the fake marriage. Pristine Hale had spent 5 agonizing years trying to destroy the Valente empire without finding a single crack in the armor. Now he held the absolute perfect weapon right in the palm of his hand. Hale did not need to prove racketeering or murder to hurt the untouchable boss, because he only needed to prove fraud in family court. He immediately filed an aggressive motion to strip Stefan and Brin of their temporary guardianship. He alleged in official court documents that the notorious mafia boss had exploited an addicted mother and used a staged financial marriage to buy 2 innocent children. Then Hale took the explosive story straight to the hungry Chicago media to ensure the damage was completely irreversible. He wanted the public outrage to be so deafening that no corrupt judge would ever dare to side with the dangerous crime family. On a quiet Monday morning, Stefan opened his phone and saw his deepest secrets splashed across the front page of the Chicago Tribune. The bold headline declared a brutal mafia boss used an arranged marriage to keep 2 orphan children in a luxury penthouse. Orion later said he heard thick glass shatter before he even had time to push open the heavy office doors. When the massive enforcer stepped into the room, the expensive glass desktop lay in 100 jagged pieces across the floor. Stefan stood in the exact center of the ruined office, with his right hand bleeding heavily from the violent impact. He was breathing hard, and his dark eyes burned with a terrifying rage Orion had only seen once in his entire life. Brin heard the loud crash from the living room and rushed down the hallway with Theo resting safely in her arms. She saw the shattered glass and the blood dripping from her husband's knuckles before she finally read the glowing screen of the dropped phone. Every single word in the terrible article was completely true, and that was exactly what made it so devastating. They were a fake couple built on a $4.5 million debt, and now the entire world was coming to rip their children away. Brin looked at the bleeding man standing among the ruins of his office, and she did not explode with her usual cold anger. She looked at him with the raw and suffocating agony of a mother about to lose the only bright things in her dark world. Stefan met her terrified gaze and knew his bloody past had finally come to collect its ultimate price. "Find Knox Wheeler and bring him to me," Stefan commanded his enforcer in a terrifyingly quiet whisper. Orion found Knox Wheeler in under 24 hours and dragged the traitor to the damp underground basement beneath an Italian restaurant on Taylor Street. It was the exact place where the Valente Empire handled messy problems that never appeared on official paper. Knox sat violently tied to a rusted iron chair in the very center of the bare concrete room. One side of his face was swollen and bleeding because Orion was never a patient man when a target tried to run. Stefan walked slowly down the concrete stairs, and his expensive shoes struck each step like a heavy countdown. Knox lifted his bruised head and looked at his former boss with absolutely terrified eyes. Stefan had seen those exact eyes a dozen times on a dozen different faces throughout his violent career. They were the desperate eyes of a man who absolutely knew he was about to die. The freezing basement smelled of damp earth and stale fear that was completely familiar to the dangerous mafia boss. Stefan stopped right in front of the tied man and let his arms hang completely still at his sides. Knox opened his bloody mouth and stammered desperately that he could explain everything. Stefan almost smiled coldly because that pathetic lie was so familiar it had completely lost all its meaning. Every single traitor in the Chicago underworld always thought they could explain their sudden greed. Orion stood completely still against the concrete wall and folded his massive arms while waiting for the final order. The brutal procedure was incredibly simple and had been executed perfectly for 15 years. Stefan would give one single nod and Orion would handle the bloody mess to ensure the city understood the terrifying cost of betrayal. Stefan stared at the trembling traitor and saw the absolute easiest answer to his massive problem. If he killed Knox, there would be no witness left for Preston Hale to use in the harsh family court. There would be nobody to legally confirm the arranged marriage and nobody to threaten the fragile guardianship of the two children. But the night before Stefan left the penthouse, Brin had come quietly to his office door. She had stood there in the quiet shadows and spoken in a voice that was not an order or a demand. She told him that if he killed one more person, he would never actually deserve to be a father to those innocent kids. She did not yell or threaten to pack her bags, but she placed her absolute boundary right on the table before walking away. Stefan had stood alone in the hallway listening to her door close, and he knew that simple sentence had to change his entire life. Now Stefan stood in the dark basement, and his mind was not focused on the bloody rules of the criminal underworld. He heard Brin singing a quiet lullaby to the baby at 3 in the morning, and he saw Phoebe holding his hand tight. He realized exactly what he would lose if he chose to stay the ruthless monster he had always been. Stefan stared at Knox long enough for the broken man to start sobbing uncontrollably in the chair. Orion slightly tilted his head because his ruthless boss never waited this incredibly long to deliver a swift death sentence. Then Stefan turned his dark eyes away from the traitor and looked directly at his loyal enforcer. "Put your gun away and call Grant Whitmore immediately," Stefan ordered in a cold and level tone. Orion did not blink, but his thick arms uncrossed, and it was the biggest reaction the hardened man had ever shown. "You are not dying today because you are worth far more alive than dead," Stefan told the sobbing lieutenant. Grant Whitmore arrived within the hour carrying a black leather briefcase and a small digital recorder. Knox was forced to confess absolutely everything Preston Hale had illegally promised him in that underground parking garage. He admitted the corrupt prosecutor had explicitly violated 3 major federal procedures to secure the stolen information about the arranged marriage. Grant wrote every single word down on a yellow legal pad and finally smiled for the first time in 30 years. The veteran lawyer had enough explosive evidence to counter-sue the federal government and completely destroy Preston Hale's aggressive career. Stefan walked up the concrete stairs and pushed open the heavy iron door to the street. He pulled the cold Chicago night air into his lungs like a man who had finally broken the surface after nearly drowning. The family court in downtown Chicago was a small room with hard wooden chairs and blinding fluorescent lights. Stefan sat beside Grant Whitmore and wore a simple gray suit instead of his usual intimidating black. Brin sat rigid right beside him with her hands clasped tightly together to hide her violent shaking. Preston Hale stood on the other side of the courtroom and looked at them with the hungry eyes of a starving predator. The ambitious federal prosecutor wasted absolutely no time and launched his vicious attack the moment the judge called the room to order. He pointed a sharp finger at Stefan and declared that the notorious mafia boss had bought 2 innocent children to fill an empty void. Hale called Stefan to the heavy wooden witness stand and walked close enough to make the air feel suffocating. He smirked and asked Stefan if it was true that medical records proved he could never father a child of his own. Hale accused the dangerous man of using his massive illegal wealth to buy human replacements because nature had completely denied him a bloodline. The entire courtroom went completely silent and Grant immediately moved to object, but Stefan gently shook his head. Stefan looked directly at Preston Hale, and did not show a single ounce of his usual terrifying mafia rage. He looked at the corrupt prosecutor with the exhausted eyes of a man who had finally stopped running from his own dark shadow. He spoke in a low and steady voice and admitted to the entire courtroom that he was completely infertile. He confessed it was the deepest shame of his life and a heavy sentence he had carried in total silence for 6 agonizing years. But Stefan continued speaking, and his voice grew stronger as he looked past the prosecutor and straight at Brin. He stated firmly that not being able to create a child did not mean he was completely unable to love one. He declared that Phoebe and Theo were not cheap replacements for the ghost of a child he would never have. He swore that when he found those freezing kids in the mud, he only wanted to keep them alive, and he would do it all over again. Brin sat in the gallery with burning tears in her eyes because the most feared man in Chicago had just stripped off his heavy armor for the entire world to see. Preston Hale scowled and immediately pivoted his brutal attack by calling Brin to the witness stand. He slammed his hands on the wooden railing and asked her directly if she had signed a fake marriage certificate just to erase a staggering $4.5 million gambling debt. The heavy silence returned to the courtroom, and Brin could hear her own rapid heartbeat thudding loudly in her ears. She looked at Stefan sitting quietly at the defense table and saw that he was not silently begging her to lie. Brin turned her face up to the stern judge and admitted that her marriage had indeed started as a cold and bitter financial arrangement. She told the absolute truth because she refused to build her new family on a fragile foundation of cheap lies. But then she raised her chin and her clear voice echoed loudly off the hard walls. She declared that if anyone asked her right now if Stefan Valente was her true husband, her answer was a permanent yes. She told the judge she had chosen this chaotic family, and she had fallen deeply in love with the man who paced the floor with a crying newborn at 3 a.m. Preston Hale opened his mouth to object, but the heavy wooden doors swung open and Jolene walked down the center aisle. She took the witness stand with her head held high and completely ignored the furious prosecutor glaring at her. Hale aggressively asked if the mafia boss had coerced her into giving up her children with violent threats and dirty money. Jolene looked straight at the judge, and her voice was as flat and hard as absolute stone. She testified that her life had been a long chain of brutal coercion, but giving her children to Stefan and Brin was the only free choice she had ever made. She told the stunned courtroom that Stefan had not bought her children, but had saved them from her own terrible failures and the monsters who own the streets. She pointed directly at Preston Hale and begged the judge not to let a greedy politician use her profound pain as a cheap weapon. The judge listened to the silent room and looked at the mountain of counter-evidence Grant Whitmore had prepared from the traitor Knox. The gavel came down with a loud crack, and the judge officially denied the prosecutor's motion while cementing the Valente family together forever. 2 weeks after the brutal court hearing, Phoebe asked Stefan a simple question at dinner that changed everything. She asked him what he did for work because her classmates had fathers who were doctors and engineers. The question was incredibly simple, but it felt terribly cruel because Stefan did not have a safe answer. He looked at his 7-year-old daughter and gave a vague answer about doing business before quickly changing the subject. But that night he sat alone in his dark office and realized he never wanted to lie to her again. The very next morning, he called Grant Whitmore and gave an order that made the veteran lawyer ask him to repeat it. Stefan ordered his lawyer to scale the entire criminal operation back immediately. Over the next 3 months, Stefan aggressively pulled out of the underground gambling lines that brought in millions of dollars. He completely cut the massive protection system on the south side and transferred the illegal nightclub fronts to other crews. He poured his vast wealth into legitimate real estate and the clean restaurant chains his family had always owned but never prioritized. Orion did not ask any questions because he simply followed orders, but Grant wrote the reason down in his notebook. Stefan was tearing down a 15-year empire solely because a little girl asked him what he did for a living. Brin knew about the massive changes not because Stefan told her, but because she saw him coming home earlier every single day. She saw him sitting at the dining table at 6 in the evening instead of midnight, and she noticed his phone rang much less. The midnight meetings with dangerous men completely stopped happening, and the heavy tension in the penthouse began to lift. Brin was not naive, and she knew Stefan could not wash away 15 years of blood with just a few months of legal business. But she could clearly see he was trying with everything he had, and that effort was enough to make something inside her shift. The bitter marriage did not change in one massive moment, but in tiny details that were almost entirely invisible. Stefan started pouring 2 cups of coffee in the morning instead of 1, and Brin started lingering after the children finished eating. Their short conversations about Phoebe and Theo slowly widened into quiet conversations about everything else. One night the kids went down early and Brin drifted off to sleep while reading on the living room sofa. Her head tilted and settled softly against Stefan's broad shoulder, and the dangerous mafia boss went completely rigid. He did not move a single muscle for the next 3 hours because he was absolutely terrified she would wake up and leave him. 6 months after the terrifying court battle, Chicago finally warmed up enough to make people want to go outside. Stefan told Brin he wanted to take the kids on a simple picnic at Millennium Park, and she looked at him in total shock. In the 2 years she had known him, she had never once heard the feared mafia boss use the word picnic. But she smiled and packed snacks into a bag before dressing Phoebe in a bright floral dress the girl had picked herself. The 4 of them stepped into the private elevator looking exactly like a real family instead of strangers who happened to share a roof. Orion drove the armored SUV and parked a short distance from the massive green lawn near the famous Crown Fountain. Brin spread a soft blanket on the grass and placed Theo down while Stefan sat beside them looking incredibly awkward. A ruthless crime boss did not have any memory of sitting on grass in a public park, and his long legs did not know how to fold comfortably. Phoebe stood on the edge of the blanket and looked around at the wide open space filled with other families playing in the sun. Then she kicked off her small shoes and put her bare feet directly into the warm grass before she started to run. She was not running away from danger or running to hide food, but she was running simply because she was 7 years old and the sky was blue. A loud and clear laugh burst out of Phoebe, and it was a real laugh Stefan had never heard before. Every other time she had smiled, it was guarded and careful, like a child who was not fully sure she was allowed to be happy. But this pure joy rose from her belly and rang across the green grass, making Stefan feel something crack open in his heavy chest. Theo crawled off the blanket and shoved a fistful of grass into his mouth, making Brin laugh as she pulled it back out. Stefan watched his 2 children in the middle of a crowded Chicago park and realized this peace was the only thing his money could never buy. Phoebe ran back to the blanket with flushed cheeks and dropped down directly between Stefan and Brin. She looked at Brin and asked in a completely ordinary tone if she was really her mom now. Brin froze with her hand still wiping Theo's face, and the loud noise of the city park seemed to completely fade away. Brin kneeled in the grass at Phoebe's eye level and took both of her small hands with absolute certainty. She told the little girl that Jolene had brought her into the world, but Brin would always be right here to stay. Phoebe wrapped her arms tightly around Brin's neck and then reached out to pull Stefan into the embrace. The 3 of them held each other on the warm grass while Theo slapped Stefan's leg and laughed because he knew everyone he loved was finally in one place. 10 years after that golden afternoon in the park, the Chicago wind blew gently across the private rooftop garden of the Valente penthouse. There were no flashing media cameras and absolutely no heavily armed bodyguards waiting in the cold shadows. Stefan Valente stood at the simple floral arch in a clean gray suit and watched the woman he loved walk slowly toward him. Brin did not wear a wildly expensive designer gown, but a simple white dress she had joyfully picked out herself. They were standing there to renew the heavy vows they had first spoken in a freezing lawyer's office to erase a $4.5 million debt. But this time there was absolutely no fear and no bitter resentment standing like a brick wall between them. Orion stood to the side with his broad shoulders completely relaxed and a rare smile pulling at the corners of his scarred mouth. Theo was 12 years old and stood tall beside his father while holding the small velvet ring box with steady hands. Stefan took Brin's hand and looked deeply into the eyes of the woman who had taught him how to be a real human being. He promised her in front of their beautiful children that he would choose her every single day for the rest of his natural life. The years rushed forward in a loud and beautiful blur that the once silent penthouse had never known before. Phoebe finally stood on the brightly lit stage at Northwestern University, wearing a dark blue graduation gown and a brilliant smile. She had earned her medical degree and aggressively refused every single offer from the wealthy private hospitals in the glittering city. She chose to work in the exact same chaotic public hospital emergency room where Brin had once tried to save broken and forgotten children. Phoebe looked out into the massive auditorium and found Stefan and Brin sitting proudly in the very first row. She leaned into the tall microphone and thanked the terrified mother who gave her birth and the two brave people who gave her a real life. She declared to the silent crowd that family was never defined by blood, but by the courageous people who chose to stay when walking away was easier. Stefan sat perfectly still and let the warm tears fall freely down his scarred face without an ounce of mafia shame. He realized with a shattering joy that the frightened 6-year-old girl he had pulled from the freezing mud was now going to save hundreds of lives. The greatest empire Stefan Valente ever built was absolutely not made of dirty money or bloody concrete or terrified whispers in the dark. It was built inside a warm living room filled with loud laughter and a profound love he had almost been too blind to accept. This powerful story reminds all of us that true power is never found in the violence we can inflict, but in the difficult mercy we choose to show. It proves that our darkest mistakes do not have to write the final tragic chapter of our lives if we are brave enough to change our path. Family is not always the people you are born to, but the people who willingly kneel in the mud to help you stand back up. Thank you for listening to this emotional journey here on Sunni Romance, where we truly believe love can conquer any darkness. Did this story make you think about the hard choices you have made to protect the people you love in your own life? Please share your deepest thoughts in the comments below, because we read every single one of your beautiful messages. Do not forget to subscribe to Sunni Romance and share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear that redemption is always possible. We wish you and your family deep peace and endless happiness, and we will see you again in the very next story.